Let's look at an example of a solitary test. So here in the bug slice, we have this action creator, add bug, which returns a plain action object that represents an API call, right? So to test this function, we have to call it and look at the object that is returned. Now we also have an API middleware that picks up this action object, then it's going to make an API call, and upon success, it's going to dispatch another action, that is bug added. We have a reducer that picks up this action and updates the store. So there are 3 building blocks or units involved when adding a bug. We can test each of these units in isolation, but the problem is that if they don't work properly together, our application is not going to work. Let me show you. So let's write a test for this function. Here in the store folder, let's add a new folder called tests. I'm going to write all of our tests here. So in this folder, let's add a new file, bugs.spec.js. Here we should define a group of tests for the bug slice. Then in this group, we can have another group for our action creators. So action creators. Now in this group, we can have a test called add bug. In our test function, we should call our action creator. So let's import it on the top. We import add bug from. Currently, we are in the tests folder. We have to go 1 level up and then load the bugs module. Now here we call the add bug function. We give it a bug object. This is the simplest bug object we can pass. So an object with this property, description set to A. Now here we could use a real value, like a real bug description, but there's really no point in polluting our tests with these real values. We want to test the functionality of our application. So as a best practice, always use simple values. So for a string, just the letter A is sufficient. Now, when we call this function, we get something, so we store it in this constant. But what do we expect from this function? We expect an object like this. This is going to be an action object, so its type should be, what is the type of this action? Well, let's take a look. In this function, we're calling the API call begin function. Let's have a quick look at this function. So we go to our API module in the store folder. This action creator returns an action object with this type, API/call begin. So back to our test, the type of this action should be API/call begin. Now we don't want to hard code this here. So let's import API call begin from the API module. Now we can replace this with API call begin .type. Now this action object should also have a payload. What do we need in this payload? Well, let's go back to our bug slice. So here we should have the URL, which is /bugs. We should have the method, the data, and the unsuccess action. So back to our test file. The URL should be /bugs. The method should be post. The data should be the bug object we're adding. That is this object we're passing to the add bug function. So I'm going to extract this and store it in a separate constant called bug. Now we can reuse it in 2 different places. Now, once again, we can hard code a value like bugs/bug added, or a better approach is to import this object in our test module. However, there's a problem here. If you remember, earlier, we decided not to export these actions from this module because I told you that these actions are really implementation detail. We should not be able to import these actions in other modules and use them. So if we want to use this in our test module, then we have to break the rules and export the details of this module. So we are breaking encapsulation. It's like opening a capsule and exposing its content. Not a good idea. But let's not worry about it for now. So back to our test file. On the top, we're going to import the bug added action and then use it over here. Bug added, the type. So here's our test. We call the function under test, and then we set an expectation. So we expect the result to equal the expected object. Okay? Now let's run our tests. All right. We have 2 test suites or test groups and 3 tests. All of these are passing. Beautiful. So we tested this action creator in isolation. Using the same technique, we could write a test for our reducer and middleware. However, as I told you before, if these building blocks are not configured to work properly together, our application is not going to work. Here's a real example. Let's go to the configure store module. This is where we're registering our API middleware. If I comment out this line and run our tests one more time, our tests are passing. That makes me think our application is working. But if we run our application, it's not going to work because that API middleware is not there to pick up this action object. To solve this problem, we have to write a separate test for this module. We have to call this function, configure store, and make sure that API is in the array of middleware functions. The problem with this approach is that our tests are getting so coupled to the implementation. They know so much about how we have structured this application. They know all the building blocks. They know that we have this function, configure store, which should return an object with these properties. They're tightly coupled to the implementation. If we change the implementation tomorrow, our tests are going to fail. Let me show you a real example. So I'm going to bring this back. Okay. Now let's go to our bugs module. So before we implemented this API middleware, I told you that in this action, we should have 3 steps. We have to make an API call. Then if the promise is resolved, we should dispatch a success action. Otherwise, we should dispatch an error action. These are the steps that we implemented in our API middleware, right? Now, let's say for whatever reason, in this particular action, we don't want to use our API middleware. So we want to implement these steps explicitly. So let's rewrite this action creator, export constant, add bug. It gets a bug object. Now here we should make an API call. So on the top, we should import Axios from Axios. Now, back over here, first we have to make an API call. So we call Axios.post. We pass the URL and this bug object as the body of our request. This returns a promise, so we'll await it to get the response. Now we should wrap this in a try-catch block. Move this over here. If everything goes well, we want to dispatch a success action. So here we're going to use bug added and give it the bug object that was saved. Otherwise, if we catch an error, we're going to dispatch a general purpose error. So for this demo, let me just type error here. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that we have changed the implementation of this action creator. Now, let me comment out this code. If we run our test again, the test that we wrote for this function is going to fail. Take a look. There you go. So our test failed because we changed the implementation, but we have not changed the behavior of our application. Our application still behaves the same way. When we add a bug, it's going to call the backend and then add that bug to the store. This is the problem with testing the implementation. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you the proper way to test this function.